Okay, well, with the extended balance sheet, we've now got a fuller picture of the true net wealth position of the client, whether they're an individual or an institution. We're almost at the stage where we can start allocating that wealth into asset classes and making investments and hopefully generating a good return for the client. Before we get to that stage though, we need to be aware of 3 different approaches, overall approaches to the asset allocation process. The first one is asset only. This is where we're not really concerned about the future liabilities, any future payouts that the client's going to make. If we think about our client as being a pension fund or an endowment or a bank, they might have certain dates in the future where they really have to meet a payout amount. Well, with asset only, an asset only asset allocation is not looking at that at all. We're purely concerned about maximising the return and minimising the risk, or maybe a combination of the two, of the assets themselves. So the liabilities aren't modelled. In later readings, we're going to come across some quite exciting approaches about how to do this. Things like mean variance optimizers and the Black Litterman approach and so on. But we're really concerned with risk, return, and you could also say the correlation of each asset class there. Okay, we want to make an efficient, diverse portfolio for our client. More detail on these coming up. The second approach is liability relative. As the name suggests, we now do have one eye on future liabilities, future payouts that the client is going to have to make. So the assets that we're investing on behalf of the client, they're invested with one eye, and we've got an important consideration. We need to have enough liquid assets in the future to be able to meet those liabilities. If you consider a pension fund, for instance, they'll model with actuaries' help, but they'll have an idea of when they have to have a certain amount of money to pay out to their retirees. So the assets, it's mainly going to be a fixed income approach here, the assets are going to be managed to meet those future liabilities. Because there are going to be some severe penalties to pay if they're unable to meet those liabilities. Okay, so in many cases, when we're doing a liability relative approach, we're going to be considering managing the surplus. Okay, so the surplus in the fund is the present value of the fund's assets minus the present value of the liabilities that are going to be paid out in the future. Okay, so ideally, the investment fund will have a bit of a surplus there. The present value of the assets will be greater than the present value of the liabilities. We need to make sure that surplus remains, or the very worst case scenario, doesn't fall below zero. So again, more detail on liability relative investing coming up. And then finally, something a little bit different, goals-based investments. This would tend to be more individuals and families rather than institutions, because there is a risk with goals-based investing that it leads to slightly suboptimal portfolio management decisions. But when we throw some behavioural finance into that, it often makes the clients very happy, which can offset that slight lack of efficiency in a traditional finance point of view. So this is where the client will have certain goals for the future. And we're going to call those goals quasi-liabilities. From the client's point of view, these are liabilities they really want to meet. What are we thinking about here? Well, things like the children's college fund. They're going to need to take some money out of the portfolio to pay for college expenses if the kids are lucky enough to have generous parents. There may be an intended bequest in the future. So when the individual dies, or maybe even before they die, they want to donate a big chunk of money to their favourite charity. And how about retirement objectives as well? So retirement income. They want to make sure they've got enough money at retirement to purchase an annuity or to buy a sports car, whatever it is they want to do with the retirement income. So each of these future goals, we're going to treat as liabilities we need to meet. And we can prioritise these goals. And what we're going to do is split up the asset portfolio now into subcategories. And each subcategory is going to be managed to make sure that each of these goals can be met in the future. Okay, a little bit more detail now then on each of these 3 overall approaches to asset allocation. We'll start off with asset only. As the name suggests, this is used when we're not keeping a close eye on the liabilities that the client may have. So we're not quantifying or considering them or modelling them at the moment. Instead, we're going to have set a required return objective at the outset to meet the client needs. And of course, we have to have a close eye on risk at the same time. Risk will often be measured just using the traditional metric of standard deviation. If we're more concerned about downside risk, if we really want to avoid shortfall risk, then we could look at downside deviation rather than the traditional two-way standard deviation. Perfectly possible to use Monte Carlo simulations If we have a few different asset allocations in mind, we can simulate what's going to happen to each of those asset allocations over time. And if we're looking at a passive approach, if our investment strategy is following the S&P 500, for example, then one risk of that investment would be that we deviate from that assigned benchmark. Okay, liability relative approach now. This approach, much more commonly used for big institutions like banks, pension funds, with legal liabilities in the future and severe legal penalties if they don't meet those liabilities. Okay, so we're going to model the assets, and our main objective here is to make sure we've got enough funds in place to meet those liabilities when they fall due. And because of that, we're going to have a heavy focus on bonds, fixed income investments here. The bonds are going to pay out just at the right point where we need to settle those liabilities. It goes without saying, really, that the risk associated with this sort of approach is not having the funds available to meet the liabilities when they fall due. Another way of saying that is shortfall risk. From a pension fund's point of view, the contributors to the fund are not going to be too happy if they turn around with 5 years to go, 5 years before maturity, and say, look guys, you're going to have to top up the fund. So there is a risk that you're going to need the plan participants to make some additional contributions, some unanticipated contributions, which isn't going to go down too well with them. And remember our surplus from before. The surplus is the present value of the investment assets minus the present value of the future liabilities. And depending on the assets and indeed the liabilities that we have, that surplus could be volatile, and that's a risk, an important risk that has to be managed. On to goals-based investing now, so the third and final overall asset allocation approach. As we said a little bit earlier, the goals are treated as quasi-liabilities. Quasi means, kind of, almost. I think I'm remembering my Latin from school there. So each goal might be the college fund for the kids, it might be a bequest, it might be future retirement income, treated as a quasi-liability, and we split up the portfolio into different silos, into different categories. And each category is managed as a separate asset allocation. There will be a separate asset allocation within each one. Usually only individuals and families are tempted or are keen with goals-based investing. The idea is that the time horizon will vary by each goal. The college fund's going to be a lot shorter term than retirement income, or the bequest perhaps. The total investment portfolio, of course, is just the sum total of all of those sub-portfolios, the individual silos that we've set up to meet each future goal. The overall risk might seem obvious, failing to meet each goal. It's important then in goals-based investing to prioritise. Some of the goals will be category A, really can't afford to miss them. The others might be more of a wish list, a nice to have, but we're not too concerned if we don't meet them.